We'll call together the meeting of the Rutherford County Comprehensive Plan Steering Committee. In the absence of Mr. Johns, I'll chair the meeting. But if you look at your agenda, you'll see that right off the bat, we've got Mr. Hafley to explain to us the analysis work that's gone into kind of beefing up scenarios that everybody should have received by email some time ago. So with that, I'll turn it over to David Hafley.
Thank you, Dale. And I just want to thank Doug and Elizabeth for finding us such a cool refuge tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, thank you for coming out tonight to the probably the 6th meeting of the steering committee. Tonight's a very important meeting because all the work that we've done today gets summarized and culminates hopefully tonight into the selection of a preferred alternative for the comprehensive plan that we can go forward with. We've made a lot of steps to get to here tonight, and Tim is going to briefly review the most immediate meeting that we all had. But the purpose of tonight's meeting is to do a couple of things. Number one is to go through a very careful analysis of the evaluation of the alternatives that we prepared. And what we've done is we've basically taken the goals that have been set out for the plan, we've looked at the 2 scenarios that we've developed, and then we've evaluated how well those scenarios meet the goals that we have set out in the plan. That is going to be the preponderance of the information that we're going to discuss tonight, and hopefully we'll be able to identify the one of the 2 alternatives that makes the most sense for Rutherford County, which we can then go forward with in terms of drafting the comprehensive plan. So we've got a lot of detailed information that we prepared for tonight, but our focus is going to be on what the information means and the conclusions that we should draw from it. Welcome. And so we'll start tonight by just doing a brief recap of the meeting that was held on May 14th, where we reviewed the alternatives, to just talk about how we developed some sense there. Tim's going to take us through a rather careful overview of the 2 scenarios. In addition to the base case, as you know, we use the Community Viz modeling software to model the 2 alternatives that we developed collectively, and we'll evaluate how those scenarios work. And then we will have a discussion of those. Dr. Pan is going to talk a bit about some of the fiscal implications of the growth in the county with respect to the work that he's been doing. And then finally, we're going to focus on where we go next. And where we hope to go next is tonight the steering committee will, at the end of their deliberations, be able to say, we like alternative 1 or alternative 2 or a combination of alternative 1 and 2 that then we can take forward and prepare into the draft comprehensive plan. The alternatives are, there's 3 of course, the base case, which is kind of the do-nothing scenario, including Infil, and then the Suburban ring. And they are not 3 isolated snapshots, but there may be alternatives or iterations that you all decide to put together to make a blended model in terms of the alternatives. But that's the work that we want to do tonight. We are on schedule to select the preferred alternative, start writing the comprehensive plan, immediately begin working on the zoning ordinance and the subdivision regulations, and keep on schedule to have all the work done in March of 2011, which is pretty much the timetable that the county commission has put us all on. So we think that we're on schedule, and we're here tonight to make some important decisions. So with that, I'll ask Tim to kind of provide an overview of the last meeting, and we can walk through the scenarios. There's a lot of detailed information, and please stop any of us at any time to ask questions about the information, or more importantly, what the information means. That's what we really need to do well tonight. So with that, Tim, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, everybody. Good to see you all again. Back on May 14th, on a Friday afternoon, we had a working group that got together to talk about the scenarios and to look at the steps we had taken up to that point to process your workshop findings into something that could be modeled and put through the computer software. we had, it was a fairly small working group, and I know those of you who could attend did, but I thought it was very productive. Those of you who were there, I hope you agree. We covered some good ground, and I thought we had a good base of information to move from, to get the modeling completed, and to bring you back some information tonight. What we did at that meeting, we walked through, we went back through what the scenario process entailed, the assumptions that we used, and I'll go over those again tonight very briefly. The new population growth, the new employment growth, and how many new households were being added or projected to be added to the county. We, at that meeting, went back through the workshop and the steps we went through with the workshop, dividing you all up into groups, into trying to look at 2 different scenarios that you all then made presentations on that evening. And we had an overview from Dr. Penn on the methodology that he was planning to employ to do a fiscal analysis of the scenarios, and he also at the meeting gave us some of his initial findings on the base case, the business as usual case that he had already been able to analyze. And then we went over the two scenarios themselves. One, the urban infill scenario, which I'll show you some detail on, and the urban infill scenario basically consisting of concentrated growth around the urban fringe areas of the 3 main cities, as well as some limited development around Eagleville, with the remainder of the county being designated for rural development. We also had, and the growth in those areas targeted into the centers that you all had identified. And then we talked about the suburban belt scenario, as we've named it, that was a little more of a tiered process with intense urban style development around the cities in a much tighter area, a belt, if you will, of suburban style growth, very similar to the densities that you have right now, and then an outer area of more rural type development with some conservation areas noted where we've had some issues raised on slope and on soil conditions. So those were the 2 scenarios that the working group that day agreed to see modeled and have the results brought back. So that's what we did over the past, I guess, almost 6 weeks now. I've been working with our modeling team on putting these scenarios through the modeling. Now, and that has been somewhat of a give and take with just dealing with the software and trying to produce, as I noted to you that day, that we're trying to produce 2 scenarios that are distinctive enough that they show some differences where any exist, but that I think a way we described them that day was they're really exaggerated development patterns, because again, you want the software and the modeling to pick up differences where it will, but they were set up to be distinctive where they could be, but they're similar in a way because we were using largely the same centers. Throughout the modeling, and I'll show you this on the maps, it worked better for the modelers to change some of the center locations a little bit, to alter them a little bit, at least for modeling purposes. Again, when you make a decision, we'll write up the plan however you wish to see it. You're not bound, you're not held to these modeling results. They're a tool to help you get to the end. They are not the end result necessarily themselves. So if I can figure out there we go. You've got handouts, and I think you've got all the slides already in front of you. So we'll start out noting again what is common across all the scenarios, the base case business as usual and our 2 alternatives. And what's similar about them are the population projections and the employment projections being used by both. That was an understanding we had coming into this process, was that we would not be creating scenarios that altered the population projections or the employment projections, and we would not be running new projections. So as you'll see when we get to some of the results, it limits somewhat the modeling differences because, again, we're talking about the same number of people. being placed in the county. It's just moving them around basically into different locations. So we're dealing with ultimate 2035 population in Rutherford County of 409,000 people, about 180,000 more than the 2006 control totals that first formed the foundation for the business as usual. So about 180,000 people being added by the end date. Job growth, about 95,000 new jobs, and about 76,000, 77,000 new households that will carry that population. So those are the same numbers that are used all across the modeling, the same numbers that Dr. Penn has had to work with in looking at his fiscal analysis. So the easiest comparison to start with, or the place to start, is with the base case. That is the scenario that was initially developed by the Metropolitan Planning Organization, the Nashville Area Metropolitan Planning Organization, that had the initial data that we took and replicated on our system and incorporated as our base case. But that is again the initial starting point, because that scenario represents it represents business as usual, existing trends going forward, existing policies playing out, all of the little small area land use plans that have been developed over the years. Those were incorporated into this plan. For the areas of the county that had no future land use policy at all, the existing zoning was used as the guide. So the base case represents sort of a hands-off approach. If everything happens in the future the way it's happened in the past, here's what you would have as a result. And this map shows you a quick comparison of the existing land use, the existing distribution of uses, and a map showing in 2035 if those 179,000 residents and those jobs are dispersed along the same pattern that you've currently got. Here's what you would see. And you'll see some variation on this graphic carried forward all the way through as we talk about some of the impacts on those measures of effectiveness. But the base case was initially developed, again, using these, what they're called suitability factors, but it was ways to decide which parcels of land would be more suitable for future growth, based, again, on the past trends, past zoning and land use, as well as there was a range of factors used to allocate future growth on parcels, such as whether or not they were in the floodplain, whether or not they were near they were endangered species and rare plant species or animal species located on the properties, how close they were to other developments, whether it was vacant land around it, how close they were to major intersections, whether or not there was any sort of transit in place, because again, these were developed on a very small scale. But those were used to disperse that future growth, throw it out throughout the county. And as has generally been the case with past development, it represented the sort of same low density, fairly scattered residential development that has taken place throughout the county over the past 20 years or so. Your non-residential uses at various locations along the major corridors. No real recognition or protection built in for your major environmental features, for your cultural or historic resources, not built in formally as policy. This just simply shows the amount of new growth anticipated. The numbers on the bottom, the darker colors, are the existing population, existing households and employment, and then showing on top in the lighter shade the amount of growth coming in. So you can see, again, the household growth, the residential growth is what the county is projected to experience in the unincorporated areas especially, with quite a bit of employment growth as well, but certainly the residential growth is the faster pace. And I believe we looked at these charts last time as well. Again, just a quick comparison between existing and the base case. On the left in the yellow, showing you the number of households being added, and on the right, the employment opportunities being added to the county. So, what did the modeling show? Well, it showed that in 2035, based on that base case, business as usual, that over half, 64% of the new households anywhere in the county were going to be in unincorporated areas of the county. And of those, 65% inside those urban growth boundaries of the cities, but 35% outside the urban growth boundaries throughout the rest of the county. For employment, though, most of the new employment projected to go inside the cities. Only 12% of new employment or job opportunities being created outside the cities in the county, and that really should be county with a T. And of those, roughly half, a little more than half of employment going inside the urban growth boundaries, and the rest of it scattered throughout the county. So some issues with the base case that were immediately obvious were what we called, and I think we looked at this last time as well, empty centers. And there's a map that, let me go ahead and go to that. In setting up the base case as originally foreseen by the MPO, they were looking at a basic center concept that we've been talking about. But where the centers were placed did not work so well with where the models were showing the future land use was going to go. And we wound up with several of these, again, empty centers. And you can see the blow-ups here from the map on the right, where a center might have been designated, but as you can see inside the black boundaries, there are no land uses there. So the base case as laid out did not really get to the point of designating a center, which is if we're going to have a node that we want to see intense development in, well, then we need to put some development in that node and not continue to be spread out randomly through the county. So that was an immediate issue that we knew we wanted to try to correct as we place new centers on the ground. So the alternatives need to be supported, the centers need to be supported by the land uses they're intended to hold, and then the policies within the plan and afterwards are what will help the centers strengthen and come to be. The land use policies, zoning policy that will be the next phase of this project, the fiscal policy where resources are devoted, where infrastructure, where services are targeted, is what will make those centers sustainable for future growth. So that was an immediate issue that we knew we wanted to try to address as we dealt with the alternatives. So, alternative scenarios. Some assumptions that, yes, sir, go ahead.
In that scenario, it looked like by 2005, basically everything's built out. Was that what it was showing?
Well, and that's
by the yellow.
Yeah, pretty much. That the way and part of this is the way the software picks up on it. If you have a 20-acre tract, but one house will be built on it, it colors the whole parcel. So there's some issue there with not splitting parcels out. But the trend is fairly obvious, and we've got a couple of little illustrations that show that as well, that played out. It pretty much puts there's some residential development pretty much everywhere in the county. Going into this, and this was a result of the discussions we've had with you all at the workshop back in May, as well as many of the community comments and citizen comments that we've heard. We felt there were some assumptions that needed to take place for both scenarios. And one thing we've heard very strongly is that future development needs to respect the natural lay of the land, the environmental features of the land, as well as start getting into a different level with your cultural, your historic resources. Again, those things that you all have stated help make Rutherford County unique, help make the communities in Rutherford County unique. So what we put in is just some understandings up front in dealing with the scenarios. Is recognizing floodplains. We discussed a little bit at the workshop the fact that you've already got built into your regulations a conservation buffer dealing with stream beds, development along stream beds. On top of that, of course, you have the designated floodplains themselves that you're already regulating as participants in the National Flood Insurance Program. But we wanted to build in the idea. Yes, ma'am.
I just have a question about that you probably covered at the workshop, and I apologize for
It's all right.
bringing it up, but with the flood that we just had the 1st of May, there are a lot of areas in the county that are nowhere near any streams that flooded dramatically, particularly the road that I live on. I was fortunate, but many of my neighbors were not at all. I know the city did some flyovers to take aerial photographs of areas that were flooded at that time. Is there thought to, and I guess I should direct this to Doug, is there thought to incorporating that into this assessment? Particularly on our road, there were places that had flooded frequently long before we had this huge rain. I see my county commissioner back here nodding his head. He knows well, I'm sure, too. And we were surprised ourselves to see houses go on some of the lots that they divided up out there. And even where they raised the level of the land 10 feet or more, they still had serious flooding problems. So I'm concerned that it's not as much about the comprehensive plan, except that we should be thinking about this as we work through this process, that our existing definitions of what floods and what doesn't, what's based on what's eligible for flood insurance and so forth, is not capturing the real conditions in this particular county.
Go over here so they can get me on the microphone. I guess to answer your question, especially in your area, I know there was a lot of issues with sinkholes. And
the county spent a lot of money to pump the area out.
Right, right. And of course, they're not designated as federal floodplain areas, like you said, because they're not really near a stream or anything, and FEMA doesn't necessarily regulate the flood plains or the flood areas that are caused by sinkholes and that. I mean, I think I'll say that at this point, that data probably hasn't been brought in here just because it's as new as it is. However, from a local regulation standpoint, I know that those flyovers that you were referring to, I think the county's actually in the process of working with the vendor who actually did the flyover, because they actually got, you know, the area within the urban growth boundary for the city, but then some areas outside as well that the county could use in the process. We're in the process of getting that data and then using that to come up with some GIS coverages to help us determine what were those elevations that were there to help us make more informed decisions if any more development occurs out that way. But yeah, I think I can say that it's probably not reflected in this analysis that we're going to have today. So.
It took me back to the problems that we had years ago, having been here long enough to see what happened in the northern part of the county, where the county actually ended up buying some houses because the flood problems simply could not be remedied. Mm-hmm. We don't want to end up there again.
Well, and I guess, and as Doug pointed out, yes, because of what happened just the last couple of months, that puts a different flavor on some of the, I'm sorry, yes, go ahead.
I just got one thing to add on that. County commissioner for that particular area, and I've since learned, since this flooding, that back when we were trying to do the superconductor in Middle Tennessee, there was an extensive report that was done. Professor Ogden out at MTSU was involved in that, and there is a report, haven't been able to track it down, of all of the underground streams and the water flows and sinkholes for this entire section that flows into Percy Priest Lake. And I was just, one of the reasons I came tonight was to make the suggestion that with all of this knowledge that's in the room here, we can find that report and incorporate that in what we're doing, because they spent a lot of time, energy, and effort on doing that, and that report exists. It's somewhere in the city, either Professor Ogden or someplace. I haven't tracked it down yet, but that does exist, and that would be very beneficial for especially that region and out near Shores Road and all that is going on. If we could find that and incorporate it in, I was just wanting to make that suggestion.
How long ago has that been? I mean, I remember that, but I mean, I remember when they were talking about the conductor.
It's in the 80s, late 70s, 80s. But Professor Ogden's out here to probably get his hands on it.
Okay. Well, for now, what we've got recognized within the plan are the existing mapped flood-prone areas as determined by FEMA. as well as the additional, the conservation buffer that you have currently in your regulations that requires a setback from the top of the bank to provide a buffer area off the stream beds. We talked about the fact that some natural issues sort of take care of themselves when it comes to development. Say an area of 25% slope is just not necessarily going to be developed because it's cost prohibitive at the same level as other properties. But we want to recognize those within the plan. We can again use our GIS-based system to quickly show where those slope areas are, and at least require, maybe through your development regulations, that there be an extra level of study from developers showing how they're going to stabilize land. But through the policies of the plan, we talked about recognizing these areas ahead of time and looking at ways to decrease the density up front. We've identified several areas within the county that are either state natural areas, wildlife management areas, and you all talked about setting a buffer around these properties to try to keep intensive development off of these sites that are they either have maybe a rare species or some endangered species on them, or they are areas around the lake that are already protected areas for wildlife. So we're going to recognize, again, a conservation buffer around those properties. There's a GIS database that I think should be close to being released. They're calling it the Heritage Inventory Program. I believe that's the one the archives are doing. Is that right? That will identify properties that have historic significance. We have, through the plan, looked at those properties that have soils that are suitable for prime farmland. That has been a big theme that we've heard from a lot of people, is trying to preserve the agricultural heritage of the county. And then I think we do believe it's good policy to put in the plan as well provisions for other resources as they're identified, as you're able to identify them and map them and show them on the ground, that your policies be flexible enough to take into account new resources. So again, those were some common assumptions that we wanted to apply to both those scenarios. So we'll get right to the two scenarios. We'll start with the suburban belt. Now, you've got in your packets maps of these scenarios. I'm sorry I don't have big ones printed out. My plotter was on the fritz today, so I don't have big ones plotted out. But you can look ahead if you want to some of the mapping. We've got it in here several times, actually, I believe. But this first scenario we'll talk about is, again, suburban belt. It uses centers, as we've discussed for several meetings, to concentrate development. We've created several different types of centers. Village centers and rural centers are the predominant ones, especially the rural centers. And those are those centers, specific areas at specific locations around the county where we wanted to run the model to see the effects of really concentrating development in those centers, increasing densities at certain specific locations, and better mixing uses together, putting homes and certain retail or maybe even civic uses close together to increase the ability to walk, to have an employment opportunity near your home rather than always having to commute to another location for a job opportunity. We also created specifically employment centers, those areas where you maybe already have an existing employment base, or where future employment is likely. Say outside of Smyrna, where they want to create a corridor for warehousing, distribution type use to take advantage of 840. So we set areas that can be recognized through zoning, if you will, for employment-related activities, industrial employment, large-scale industrial opportunities, so that as development maybe is planned around them, that you understand what those areas are intended for and that you don't set up conflicts with future uses. Activity centers set up, that was carried forward from the base case on property north end of the county there, near the Speedway in Wilson County. Then character areas. We've talked about character areas somewhat through this process as sort of the backdrop or the background development pattern through the county. I think we only had about three or four character areas: urban, Through this plan, we created an urban fringe character area, a suburban character area that pretty much reflects the existing development pattern, a rural character area for those areas where we felt that current levels of density just wouldn't be appropriate, as well as the conservation areas for lands that have actual physical impediments to growth. So the suburban belt uses a mixture of the centers and the character areas to concentrate the development. How did we do that? We did it by looking at, and this was again sort of the back and forth between the modelers and ourselves here on what the software was picking up, and so we made a little bit of changes to some of these boundaries maybe from what we saw back on the 14th. But we looked at what would happen if we ran a scenario that held the very highest intensity growth to an area pretty much around the city of Murfreesboro and within the urban growth boundary of Smyrna. Basically that upper quarter. If you'll remember, we've set up initially some study areas. It basically is that study area 1, that's the 3 main cities along 24 and their immediate growth boundary. So we ran the model to drive a majority of the growth, and we'll show you how much, into that footprint right around Murfreesboro and Smyrna's urban growth boundary, but also with a finger down 24 to pick up that employment area well, right around where we are, I guess, here and a little bit south. So within that urban fringe, we looked at the cities as really being the most intense urban style development because that's generally the way things work out. But within the urban fringe itself, that tight area around Murfreesboro and then the Smyrna growth boundary, having that as just a slightly less dense, and I've got lookup tables that show you different densities for different land uses, and I don't want to throw all that up here, but it'll all be in the plan and it's all made available to you. But it's similar to what you might find in the cities, but a little bit less intense. Mix of use is similar, but slightly less dense. But outside of that fringe, there's a belt that's created of suburban development, suburban character area, that is pretty much similar to the current development pattern. You've got such a predominant pattern already set in this county that it seemed feasible then to look at a scenario that sort of steps down the growth, the densities that would be allowed from the really intense municipal type development to the more rural type development. It's sort of a buffer area, if you will, around the cities. That again pretty much carries the existing development pattern forward. And then a rural character area that picks up at the edge of the suburban character area and runs to the edge of the county. We identified a couple of spots at our workshop that we believe would have the most likelihood for conservation, needing conservation because of slope or because of soil, because of rocky ground. And those, they're shown on the map, but the boundaries are not exact. They would be actually where the conditions exist on the ground. But you have basically a 3-tiered approach: urban, suburban, and then a rural area radiating out from the cities. The other scenario we looked at was an urban infill. And it was one that, again, does bear similarity to the first one because we use the rural and the village centers again. We varied a little bit the number of them just simply so the software could try to pick up some differences. And you'll notice when we look at the maps, the best way to run those was to set up the urban area right around the cities, but larger than the one in the suburban belt, and without using designated centers within them, but just assuming urban intense development anywhere within that urban character area. Outside of it, rural. And again, what you can see on the maps, what the this is the urban infill character area here. You can see we've got it's a larger boundary. It's roughly the suburban boundary, but a little bit tighter. Where inside those areas, again, pretty much intense development, intense urban style development with everything outside of it modeled for rural development, with really driving the growth into these various centers: rural, village center, employment, rural, and village at Eagleville. Again, that stands in contrast to the suburban character area where we did continue to model the centers even closer to the cities. But you can see the darker tan. That's the urban footprint in the. This is even better. You can see the darker footprint here of urban. That's the urban fringe, I believe we're calling it. And then this lighter tan, that's the suburban belt. Again, takes into account a lot of the existing development that's already out there. Then the light green area, rural, dark green area, the conservation. And on the right, the urban infill, where we have urban versus rural. No urban step down, if you will.
Tim, earlier you said that your development scenarios took into account the existing infrastructure, existing roads, and I guess the major roads, and you try to develop the models with those in mind. And I have a drawing that you all developed that also showed the major thoroughfare plan roads. The suburban model has an area on the east side of town that shows, not this drawing, but right where you have your pointer.
Okay.
The Joby Jackson Parkway is projected to go right up through that area.
Yes, sir.
And I think that fly likes to attack whoever's talking.
I say that.
But I'm glad one of our county commissioners is here. I know public officials, elected officials, don't like to build roads that they can't develop along. And that's something that, you always, why do they build that road? Doesn't make any sense they built that road. I think they'd catch a lot of flack if we didn't allow development along that. And you see that green that's, I wish I had a pointer here. Jump up here. The road is to go right up through this area. And we're showing not allowing any development up through that area. I think we'd catch a lot of flack if we stuck with that.
Well, the little finger there, and we did that at the workshop. That may have been some floodplain passing through there, and that's why I think that's maybe why we ran this line here. Now, again, the light green doesn't mean no development. The light green means probably lesser development. It's rural character, so a little bit less intense. And I think we did that again to recognize the presence of the floodplain, so you would almost automatically have to back off density, in the floodplain.
That light blue line that runs more east-west is the East Fork Stones River.
Okay.
The density, I think, is, for that color, is 1 dwelling unit per 5 acres, which is pretty light. And the template for that road, and Doug probably knows it better than I do, but for what I've seen for Joby Jackson has been a 4 to 5 lane road. And where it shows tying in is right around Brown's Store, Canesville Pike. And if we're going to build a 4 lane road and, right through there, it may transition to a 5 lane. I'd hate to see us not allow any development along that.
I understand what you're saying, and we did have that in mind as they were drawing up these scenarios, and especially on the urban infill. I know the modelers made an attempt to keep that urban boundary, if not right on that roadway, then just right adjacent to it, noting the fact that while, yes, we wanted to try to create a couple of centers to really concentrate growth, that you don't know yet what will come about. So, I mean, that is taken into account. This may have been a finger of a particular kind of soil, and I just can't remember exactly why this finger came in like it did. But again, this is not your future zoning map. This was just an attempt to recognize some existing and those future features that we could build into the model. So any of this can be adjusted, obviously, and you'll eventually set up policies that could specifically address the new parkway and how you'd like to see development on that parkway, whether you want to see it developed, just as a corridor and as a ring, or do you want to try to concentrate development in a couple of locations? Do you want to try to do some variations on that where maybe you do not just cut on the road, but do some access roads or whatever? But I mean, yes, we did take into account the fact you are having a ring road built around the city, basically, and that either one of these scenarios favors intense development, if not on the roadway, pretty close to it.
Okay.
So that finger notwithstanding, I mean, you know, we did have that in mind as we looked at this.
Okay, well, I have a drawing, I wish you could see it, but it's one that you all had issued us, and I printed out and brought it with me, and it just shows it going right up through the middle of the area that doesn't allow but one dwelling unit per 5 acres. But you did say that, and correct me if I heard you wrong, that we would have some input into moving some lines or something?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Right. Again, and that's why I probably didn't do a very good job of it at the beginning, noting that what we've prepared here are these two models that went through the software. The purpose of them is just to give you an idea of how your future development numbers could be influenced by different choices you make. Okay. You know, this is not, again, intended to be your new zoning map.
Okay.
At all. This is a plan that you grow into over the next 20 years or so, and you'll make modifications as you go, and you'll change some of these things, and these character areas won't stand like they're modeled. The centers probably won't turn out exactly like they're modeled. They're not intended to. They're just intended to give you an idea of how different things could turn out. But certainly, as things are built and as new roadways are open, you have to take them into account.
Well, I'd like to make the point that the road plan is redone on a regular basis. That stretch of it, I believe, is a long-term improvement.
It is.
Yeah, and I think it's not a 4-lane road.
Okay, I haven't seen the template for that portion.
But I do remember when we were talking about this in the workshops, we had talked about having 2 village centers set up sort of north and south of each other over there. I think to kind of recognize that fact that you do have the roadway going there, but what would happen if we concentrated development at 2 existing crossroads rather than just strip style down the highway? But the real strength of your plan is going to be in the written policies anyway, and how you want to see them applied as individual developments come in, not just this static map or some variation on it. But your strength is going to be in the policies and how you instruct that your zoning and your subdivision regulations be amended in the future.
All right. Another question. I see the southernmost rural center that we have on the map. That's Fosterville.
Yes, sir.
And that is right in the middle of a conservation area, which doesn't allow for development.
Well, again, now this conservation boundary, this is just an approximation. We had to put a line somewhere, but we approximated where we knew that there could be some issues with land development anyway. A center probably makes decent sense there in that there's some existing development already there. And where you've already got a development footprint, trying to encourage future development there rather than in some other location along the conservation, somewhere in that conservation area.
Tim, is that conservation area, I'm just looking at the location of that and then the little one to the west, is it primarily where the 25% slopes are?
I believe so, this one especially.
So if we zoomed in on it more closely, we'd see that there are areas within that green blob that don't have 25% slopes.
Yes.
That, based on the policy, we should anticipate would be.
Exactly, and that's again where I was saying the strength of this will be in the policies where they will state where you have 25% slope, development needs to be backed off. Where you don't, it doesn't. But this just gives an idea again for general purposes that in this area it bears extra scrutiny.
Because it's not as though the entire area is on this one big 25% slope if you drive through there. You know.
It's just where you're more likely to run into those sort of issues. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
Isn't there an area on the north side of the county that's like that? Or it may be outside of the county line, but I was thinking.
On the Wilson line?
Yes.
North of Las Casas there?
Yes.
I think that's after you get across the line into Wilson.
Right over the line.
Okay.
I guess a process question that relates probably more to our local officials, to Doug and Commissioner Williams, and raised by Mark's question about the long-term major thoroughfare plan. Is it possible or likely or planned or not anticipated at all that there would be adjustments in that plan as time went on, and that this plan might influence that plan in some way?
I think I guess the quick answer to that question is yes, it would. The current thoroughfare plan that we're under right now, I believe, was adopted in 2004. Now, there was a reconciliation study done with the city of Murfreesboro in 2006 that took both the plans, because there's some differences in the two of them, kind of put them together, and we hashed out the differences. I've had some conversations with Dana Richardson at the city about their timeframes for looking at another update to their thoroughfare plan, with the thought that it probably would be a good idea for us to try to do what we did the last time back in 2004, do them at the same time. The fact that we would have this now, I think, kind of lends a little more weight to what road improvements we would want to see in certain areas, and maybe what road improvements we don't want to see, because of our growth patterns that we're anticipating, and in the future land uses that we're talking about with these maps. So I think this would be a good component of that. So.
Whichever plan you ultimately, or whatever variation you select to go, you go with, we have also gone through with the county's assistance a designation of most of the major roadways in the county for plan purposes. We labeled suburban roads, urban roads. We did that at the workshop too, didn't we? We started on that too, and which ones would be more rural or scenic in nature. It had less to do with the actual roadway itself and the carrying capacity of the roadway and the functioning of the roadway. It has to do more with how you'll make the land uses relate to that. So there will be a sense in this plan that different roadways that are used in different ways will be developed in different manner that can, so that your land policy doesn't work in contrast with the thoroughfare plan, but it works more in concert with it. So that will be reflected in the final plan as well, those designations of roadways.
Just one more quick process question. Looking at the size of the various colored blobs and thinking about the different densities in them, is the size of the blobs related in any way to the population projections and any kind of estimate of how much of each kind of thing you might need to accommodate that population?
Yes. I mean, we began with just sort of a general buffer. But we've actually gone through in the model and selected some parcels to include in, so there are different acreages along with it. That's not the purpose of this, though, wasn't to try to get out and do a zoning map in advance. But we'd have some illustrations in a few slides that show proposed densities, because we did assign, again, certain number of uses, certain number of dwelling units for each of these different types of centers. So it's built, and there's also a built-in mixed-use component to different ones of them. So there is, again, that's done for modeling purposes. It's not necessarily your guide for future zoning, but it's built into this an assumption that, yes, different centers have different densities and a different mix of uses depending on whether it's a rural or a village or an employment center, activity center. And again, we did some illustrations later on that show not just the locations of land uses, but what the density starts to look like. So almost a heat map showing where the most of the people would be under these scenarios.
And just a little follow-up to that, because we're guessing at what our future needs are going to be for developing this way or that way. Do we have any information at all? Is it possible to get any information on what people are going to want? The people who we're expecting another 100,000 people to arrive here over the course of the next 15 or 20 years. Do we have reason to have any idea what they want? Do they want to be in one of these suburban character areas, or a more urban area, or one of the rural centers, or what? So how do we know how much of each of those kinds of things it makes sense to put on those maps?
No. I mean, if you're asking, is there any way that we use to determine sort of a consumer preference, I guess? No. Other than, and again, in dealing with the modeling and how much growth to put in centers versus outside of centers, I relied on the experience of the folks who have done this in different areas, and that's where we got our percentages to break down and say send 85% of new growth into the urban growth boundaries and the remainder in centers. But no, I'm not aware of anything specific to Middle Tennessee, frankly, that shows. I mean, I guess it would be possible to look at how people have bought in the past and what sort of developments seem to be moving quicker than others, whether the compact mixed-use developments, at least the ones I'm aware of anecdotally, as the market permits and as financing permits, those do seem to sell out very well. But then by the same token, your traditional subdivisions, depending on the price point, they seem to go well. Also, this is where hopefully we'll get a reaction from those who do this for a living, the developers and the builders, who not only build in Rutherford County but in other areas of Middle Tennessee and beyond. Where is the market pointing at this time, especially after the economic downturn we've been into? Are people looking for more compact environments? Are they looking for large lots still? And so that's why within the plan, we've tried to build in something for everybody, if you will. Again, those existing suburban areas that can be built out like they have been, as well as something new, which would be try to build an incentive for the more urban-centered, more compact design that you see in some other areas and haven't had so much of here.
Just an observation as a builder. Since '07, people's tastes have changed tremendously. And I have seen house plans that I have built the same plan for 12 years, and then all the buyers called themselves one weekend and that house quit selling. We had a subdivision one time that had all these, had 4 or 5 plans, and we were building the same one. And when we got down to it, there were 7 of this one house plan that we'd been selling for 12 years that were left. And it was like, okay, who called y'all? And I don't know how you could factor that in, because the public's taste is very fickle, and you don't know what's going to change it. Like you said, you just got to make some assumptions and go with it. But if I knew what you're asking, I'd probably be one of the top 2 builders in the U.S. So.
Well, I think a point to make is, of course, it could be done a different way, but this is going to be implemented primarily through zoning. And if you say that something's going to be an urban fringe and therefore higher density is allowed within it, it does not typically exclude the lower density.
No.
So if consumer preference is towards the lower density, then that's actually what's going to be built no matter what we call it. But by calling it urban fringe and zoning it for urban fringe, then there's an incentive there to build in.
Right, and again, part of the ways that you can influence that is by careful planning in the future of how you expend resources, of where the water and sewer providers target their resources, where the school board looks at when to expand versus and where new roads are built. So part of this is a guide to those who provide those resources, as well as, again, trying to offer some incentives to those on the market side of it, because, the market will dictate. If the bottom fell out of the housing market, then this is a wonderful exercise, but it's probably going to take a lot longer to play out. So I wish I had a better answer for you there, Lanice, but I don't. Okay. Boom. Okay, so let's do some comparisons here. This is where we have... This was the point of modeling, really, was to look at the impact of these different scenarios on those measures of effectiveness we've talked about. So we had quite a few measures of effectiveness. We pulled out about 5 that we could feature very strongly for you here to help you make some comparisons. Just raw land consumption based on current trends, or based on the current situation. we're showing out of all the land in the county, about 50,000 acres are currently developed outside of your cities, and that about 16% of the total parcel acres in the whole county. Using that base case scenario, existing trends playing out, then to accommodate the new people based on the current densities, you'd need about 201,000 additional acres to be developed to accommodate the new growth. That's about almost 80% of the undeveloped parcel acres in the county. Only 40% of those acres inside the urban growth boundaries of the cities. Over 60% of the developed acres taking place outside of the urban growth boundaries. So that's one metric to look at, roughly, again, 200,000 acres to be developed to accommodate the additional growth. But if we look at that compared to the alternatives, you see some, because we are, again, proposing increased densities in some areas and then using these centers to target growth, still quite a bit of land being consumed, but less, 50,000 less acres, 152,000 in the suburban belt, about 60% of the total parcel acres in the county, and even under urban infill, 150,000, about 58% of the total parcel acres. And again, that's, and I'll show you, if you wish, the lookup tables, the densities we're talking about, that's presuming a certain, number of people per acre. That could change. If you wanted to see fewer acres consumed, then you might try increasing densities in certain acres, or putting policies in place that maybe encourage more multifamily development, that put more households on the same land, rather than continually spreading them out. Under the suburban belt, about 9% of the new parcel acres developed are within those centers. So again, that's just a function of how we set that density up to start with. It's not necessarily the end result, but it's just what we fed into the model. About 30% in that urban fringe area, you can see outlined in red on top around the cities, but 48% outside the urban growth boundaries. The urban infill, a little bit less development winds up in the centers, because what we've modeled there is just sort of a larger urban area within that fringe. On the bottom map, you can see the red around Murfreesboro and around Smyrna especially, without using designated centers within those areas, but just in the rural area. And 30% in the urban fringe, still over 50% of the developed land taking place outside of the urban growth boundaries. So putting them side by side, you see again, especially looking at the bottom number, the total acres developed, that either one of the alternatives to the base case has fewer developed acres, and we'll show you in just a minute that that includes some of the prime farmland acres as well. Fewer acres developed under suburban belt, naturally, because again, we're pushing development through the model, pushing development into the centers and increasing some densities and decreasing others in different areas of the county.
Tim, on that slide, that under base case outside the UGB, should that be 121,000?
Well, it's, yeah.
On the, yeah, 2 slides back.
I think you're right.
And for it to come to 201,400 as the total.
So
I think that's where it belongs. 2 slides back, you said 79,000 was inside the UGB with the base case, and 122,000 was outside.
Yes. No.
Yeah, down there at the bottom.
Right, 122. You're right. Thank you, Lennox. Fix that before we put this out for a publication on the web. And you can see our modeler highlighted the amount of growth going into centers. Under our base case, we don't. There was very little. We go back to those empty centers. There were centers set up, but there was no land use model to them, so it didn't have any impact. At least through either of our alternatives, we start to see more of the development concentrated in those designated areas, in those predetermined centers. Okay. Here it is in graphic format for you to see on the bottom. the existing development, the amount of existing development under each of the scenarios, which is the same, and then the acres consumed under either one of the scenarios. And again, not a lot of difference in the two alternatives. Land use itself. Here are 3 scenarios side by side. Using the assumptions that we talked about going into it, you could see how the future land use would be distributed out there in the county. Base case on the left, pretty much a continuation of your current patterns. And here we can see, and it's more refined here, it's not just that solid yellow that we noted earlier, but it's a little bit more refined. But still, you can see new residential development basically taking place in all areas of the county, and more scattered commercial development or non-residential development taking place. In our suburban belt, we see somewhat tighter development around the cities. You still have some scattering out here, but not quite as much. But we do see an intensification of commercial uses in a couple of our center areas. Whoops. Previous. Along the main corridor here, 231, down 24. This would still have, like I said, some scattering of residential development out in what would be the belt. And then you can see we have somewhat less development projected along the fringe in the rural area and where our conservation areas would likely be. The urban infill, you can see a deeper footprint in that bubble around the cities. No stepping down transition area between urban and rural, but you still have some scattering of development outside in the more rural areas. And part of that is because one of the suitability factors built in was the attractiveness of land based on existing development. Where you have existing development, that can be a draw for new development. So because you have such an established residential pattern out here, is still a draw for future development. Somebody have their hand up.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
About our land consumption.
Yes, sir.
If I understand this correctly, currently we have 16% of parcels developed with the current population. Is that correct?
I believe that sounds
based on acreage.
Right? Yeah. And if we assume that we had densities going forward similar to what we have now, which is the point of this discussion about how we mix that up, how is it that we increase the population 80% or some number like that? We've consumed so much more land,
well,
I think is my point.
Yes.
It's happening, we really need to look at this, but I'm not seeing that math.
No, and part of this, again, is just limitations of this software in that, again, it tagged an entire parcel. If you put some development on it, it pulled that entire parcel into the developed column. So, yes, I think we could roughly, and I talked about this a little bit with our modeler, we could probably shave some of that 78% down, but you're still going to have, of the total parcels, you're going to have probably close to that number touched by development. Now, again, it may be you split it down in the future, and this is not 78% of the land in the county being developed, but of the total number of existing parcels. Now, again, in the future, they'll probably split down, but if your current parcel line's held, 78% of the new parcels would be touched by development.
I think part of the answer could be in the slide with the bars on it. You can go down. It says acres developed unincorporated. So if we look at that first bar there where it says 18% for existing, that's 18% of the unincorporated area?
Yes.
Is that correct? So the incorporated area would have who knows how much?
Right, well, I mean, and there is
so this bar is, I mean, this set of bars here is showing how much is going to land, how much development, the last 3 bars, how much development is going to occur in the currently unincorporated area. But if we looked at it in hindsight and said existing, then as those areas develop and get incorporated, which many of them will be,
True.
I mean, if you included the existing incorporated areas on there, you wouldn't see that big, huge difference between the first bar and those other 3, I don't think.
And that was another condition built into the scenario process when we went into it. There was a split that was already predicted for how much development would go into the cities and how much would remain in the county, and we didn't vary that split. at all. We just, again, looked at the existing density, carried it forward, how many parcels are out there.
In other words, that 18% right there, that doesn't, all 250,000 of us who currently live here don't live in that 18%.
No, that is outside the corporate
Many,
limits.
many of us live in the incorporated area that's not depicted on this.
That's right.
Let me just jump in here.
Yes, sir.
For a second. All three scenarios call for much more population growth in the unincorporated areas than we've seen in the past. Is that right? So to explain why many more acres are going to be used up than we've seen in the past.
And I think we noted on one of the, well, I'll scan back through these. Yes, the base case itself projected that 65% of all the new households in the county were going to go outside the corporate limits of the cities. But that presupposes, again, the corporate limits stay static.
Right.
Yes.
How many, looking at that first bar, it's less than 50,000 acres. How many acres are there in the entire county? Do you know, Doug, right off the top of your head? Put you on the spot.
I could multiply, there's 611 square miles of land. Somebody multiply that out. Somebody with a calculator.
Because I think there's just a whole lot of land that's not on this chart, and it would make those bars look very, very different if it were. If we dialed back 10 years even and did a chart at that time compared to now, the existing would still be a little bar, and then the others would be great big. So what we're seeing here is apples to oranges, I think, as far as your question.
In a way, but
because we're not really, all of the people that we've already had up to this point are not living in that 18%. They're living in a much bigger number of acres
the implication
that
from
were
all
unincorporated at the time.
the implication from all this, again, anyway, is to not try to hit a particular target number on your future development, because you won't go back, in 20 years and go, well, let's see, how did we distribute that development across these parcel acres necessarily, but to show, is there a difference in how much land would be consumed if we intensify development in centers versus low density. So yes, there's a general savings in land consumed, not as pronounced as I thought there might be to start with, but there is somewhat of a savings. And then these maps start to get into showing you, well, let's break that down and carry it forward with the non-residential development built in too. Is there any concentration of non-residential development as well from the base case to three scenarios? We see some intensification of them, but then there's not a lot of non-residential development planned for the county at all to start with. Again, I think it was about 12% of future employment growth, something like that, projected outside the corporate limits anyway, so there's not a lot to model out there.
Tim, I'm just curious, what density did you all use for land within the urban growth boundary for your base scenario?
Think about
because I think that
4 units per acre. I think it was 4 within that.
So and it's, I see Margaret Ann back there. It's probably a lot denser than that. We're seeing a lot, planned residential developments and.
Actually, yeah, we're actually single-family residential. At least, no, you're not talking about within the centers. Within the centers, we did up to 8 units per acre. Just for the general character areas, general urban, yes, immediately adjacent to the city's 10 units per acre, and then it starts to go down from there to 6 in the urban fringe, 4 in the suburban character area, 4 units per acre. 1 unit per acre, single family in the rural. So, this map starts to give us a sense of the densities. The darker colors being the more intense development, and the lighter colors being the less intense development. With the base case, you can see that there's, it's fairly well scattered around different areas of the county. Yes, some concentration near the cities, but also down the south end from, Christiana over, and then along 99 and out past Las Casas. In the suburban character area, the suburban belt scenario, the red line outlines our real intense urban area. And you can see that's where a majority of the density is proposed to go. Again, there's development out here, but it's low density, with some pockets at our centers. But the most intense densities in this very tight area near the cities. The urban infill, a little broader area of density because we were not, again, we held this general urban fringe to I think a mile from the corporate limits of Murfreesboro, and then went down and picked up this employment area. Here, the general urban area, because there's no suburban belt step down, again, a broader area of urban development and still some pockets of density. But, in comparing it to the base case, comparing it to, current trends going forward, you do see more of a concentration of development in certain spots. Again, the implication is it should supposedly make it easier to provide services, to project needs for maintenance and upkeep of targeted areas as opposed to a more scattered development pattern. And there we go. There it is, 65% of new households going within urban growth boundaries roughly, putting them more near urban level services for the base case, very dispersed. You add the suburban belt on top of that, we put a little more development into these centers. We wind up with, 85% in the centers and the urban fringe. Urban infill, roughly comparable. Still, we wind up with 81% of our new households in the urban growth boundaries as compared to 65%, which still leaves about 20% of your development out in the rural area. So that's just looking at the residential development. If you look at the impact on farmland, let me go put the three comparisons up. And this is, again, this is using land that was labeled by the Department of Agriculture as being most suitable for farming. Based on the base case, current trends, 83,000 acres of prime farmland available as of now. Under our base case, 69,000 acres touched by development, consumed by development. That's 83% of your total prime farmland. Under the base case, suburban belt, it has a somewhat less impact on prime farmland, total 67% consumed by development. About 13,000 acres less than the base case. You put the urban infill on that, and so it's roughly comparable. So either one of these two alternatives would, at least through the modeling, use less land that is identified as prime farmland, soils both suitable for prime farmland. Here's bar chart. You can see the same breakdown. We talked about schools and a little bit as being impacted by development and having an impact on development. We have not pulled information in that deals with specific schools, with capacities and enrollment and whatnot, but we thought it relevant to at least point out how would future development relate to the current schools. So we ran the model just to show how much of the new development would be in a certain proximity to the new schools, to the existing schools. Under the base case, and we used a 2-mile metric, just as one to use for measurement. Under the base case, 20,000 of the new households would be within 2 miles of a school. Roughly half, a little less than half of all the new households under the base case would be built somewhere within 2 miles of an existing school. Under the suburban belt, by trying to cluster development somewhere near a school, about 50% then of new households. Not a big difference, but some difference, as well as under the urban infill. And that the implication from that is that in working in the future, the Planning Commission working with the school board on new development, how would the school board like to see future development laid out? Do they have a preference as well on seeing development near a school? Is there an advantage then to putting to trying to build up density around schools with existing capacity as opposed to those already over capacity? How could communities be better integrated with the schools? We've talked about that a little bit. Locating future public services somewhere around those school sites where schools already form an anchor for communities. So anyway, at least through our modeling, we've shown that you can that we can increase the number of schools within a certain proximity, for good or for bad, to existing school sites. Water and sewer, what we looked at here was, again, because we're dealing with the same future population across the board, the consumption is pretty much the same. We'll have the same number of households, and whether they're located here or located there, we're still going to use about the same amount of water. So what we looked at was how many of the new households and how much of the usage would be within, say, the urban growth boundaries of the cities, where you're more likely to be near treatment capacity, where existing lines are more likely to be and therefore require fewer extensions and fewer costs to serve households. So through the base case, you could see that the projected population would use another 15.6 million gallons per day of water. About 10 million of those gallons are within an urban growth boundary and 5 million are not. That's again under the base case. Under the suburban belt, 11.4 million gallons in an urban growth boundary, 4.2 outside an urban growth boundary. Under urban infill, a little bit more of the water usage within those growth boundaries and a little bit less outside the boundaries. We don't have...
I'm sorry. I apologize for interrupting.
No, please go ahead.
What is is there a known capacity existing for consolidated utility for water?
Or even in Percy Priest Lake.
Well,
have you
that's
talked
true.
to the
Yeah.
Corps
Any of the
about whether this is even possible?
Well, there is. We do not have that information on what the outstanding capacity is. I mean, we know what the treatment capacities are of the water plants. If you're talking about, though, in terms of the supply.
That's the issue.
Yeah.
But these numbers probably do exceed the current allocation, don't they?
Oh, absolutely.
By a long
We're
ways.
above the current
By large
allocation
numbers.
now.
Yes, but I don't know by how much. But we do know that based on the current projections of population, it's 15.6 million gallons to serve those households, regardless of where they go.
Will part of the process as you work your way through this be to find out, there's a reallocation study being done now by the Corps on Percy Priest Lake, and I believe there's also one for the Cumberland River, which isn't, the main stem is not normally a water supply source. They don't allocate water for that. It's not part of the authorization for them to do that. And from another project that I'm working on, there's a lot of concern about whether there is enough water to reallocate to other uses, and the expectation is that if they reallocate in Percy Priest, they're going to reallocate from, they can't reallocate from flood storage. As a practical matter, they've got to have that. So that really pretty much, it's not a navigation system. There's no lock there. So where they have to reallocate from is electrical supply, which means they'll use less water to generate electricity in order to hold enough water back to serve the population, in which case that's the cheapest electricity that we're generating now. And so we're losing the cheapest source of electricity for, this is a really big increase. This is a really big increase over what we've got right now. It's something that I think would be helpful for us to know and understand, and the public in general to know and understand as we work through this process and then roll this out.
Then, I mean, is that information widely available, at least on under these different scenarios of whether they...
I would encourage you to contact Ben Rohrbach with the Corps.
Good idea. Because we had not been successful in pulling that information in. So I thought the best we could do at this point was at least show what the projections show for the new demand. And then the allocations are what they are.
Since they haven't completed the studies, they can't tell you how much water there will be, but they can talk about some of the issues and give you that information so that it can be provided to people generally as they look at this, and
plus how much is
needs to inform their expectations about what's really going to happen over the next 20, 30 years.
Plus how much is being allocated now.
Right, and of course, this number represents again a 2035 build out. So there's time in there to maybe
enlarge
its development will phase in to what to dig a bigger ditch.
Because CUD has requested additional,
For how many years?
last 5 years maybe?
Sewer demand. Again, it's a fixed amount of sewer demand to serve the new population, 11.2 million gallons. Under the base case would place about 65% of that new growth within the urban growth boundaries of cities. Again, the idea being that we use the UGB as a breakdown because, again, that puts those areas somewhat within easier reach of a municipal sewer system as opposed to the step systems or even septic tanks. Under the suburban belt and the urban infill, some increase in the number of households and therefore the usage within urban growth boundaries, but still quite a bit going outside the growth boundaries. You know, at least almost 30% here, about 20% here. That would necessitate either quite an extension of sewer lines or more step systems that have to be maintained locally, or even septics if you can still get those. All right, one final graphic here. It places a side-by-side your existing situation with the base case, with the suburban belt and the urban infill. And again, and I've made the point several times that we were bound by common projections among all scenarios, with the really big variations where they do exist between the base case and really either of the two alternatives, either the suburban belt or the urban infill, that places more growth in centers. The suburban belt really has the advantage on that. And certainly when you count the centers and the urban fringe, and the idea being, again, concentrating those uses so you know where to provide services more in the future, certainly an advantage there. 85% of new growth versus 71% of households. And then on down the line, especially through the developed acres. However we count the acres or how the development affects the number of parcels, it certainly works out that both of these two scenarios have a smaller development footprint, if you will, than the base case business as usual scenario going forward. And then an advantage either one of these have on the farmland consumed. If you have questions, I'll be glad to take them. But I thought what would be best at this point then is to follow up this sort of land and analysis with the information Dr. Penn has been able to pull together on fiscal impacts, and then we'll come back at the end and wrap that up. Dr. Penn, you want me to load you up? Which one are you? This one?
Now, neglected to bring copies in case you're looking for them in your packet. Sorry about that. So you'll have to turn around a little bit so you can see the screen. All right, my task tonight is to look at some of the fiscal impacts of the business as usual scenario. And I've decided to focus on the portions of the budget expenditures and revenue that are relevant to the scenarios. And going through the budget, clearly the local option sales tax that funds primary government that's collected in the unincorporated areas is relevant. The property tax, as it funds some of the services that are provided in the unincorporated areas, also is relevant. Then on the expenditure side, solid waste and highways. A large portion of the budget, both expenditures and revenues, is not sensitive to where the growth occurs. Revenues are generated, for example, for property tax, countywide, wheel tax, countywide, expenditures for law enforcement, for administration of justice, and so on, countywide. So if you boil it down and really go through the budget and try to figure out how much expenditures could depend on where that growth occurs, I came up with about 8% of primary government expenditures. And if you add schools in there, we're talking about 3% of the budget could be sensitive to where the growth occurs. And I'm talking about whether the growth occurs in the urban areas or in the unincorporated areas. So we're not talking about a big part of the budget here. Right, so I mentioned that.
May I ask a quick question?
Yes.
When you say there's not a big effect, you're talking about whichever choice you have?
Whichever scenario you pick. The budget impact is not going to give you much, is not going to provide you a criterion to choose between the scenarios.
Maybe this is not the time to ask the question, but there are factors that are traditionally looked at in counties or other jurisdictions that would indicate the ability of the taxpayers to bear a certain burden of tax based on their income and the cost of living and all those factors. And so when you look at that in terms of Rutherford County, and it may be later on in your slides there, what effect does growth have on that ratio? And if I'm too soon and ask that question, then
no, that's fine. Let me keep that in mind.
Okay.
Come back to that. So I mentioned that, what I'm saying is that we're going to focus on those things that could differ depending on where the growth occurs. That's local option sales tax, solid waste, and highway and street maintenance. And those things are going to be the same regardless of where the growth is going to occur. I'm not going to spend much time on. Your question gets at how do we accommodate any of this growth, any scenario? I think what you're asking. And from looking at the projections of growth in the unincorporated area, regardless of scenario, that's a big change from what we've seen in the past. So the biggest fiscal difference is going to be what's going to occur in the future according to any of the scenarios compared to what happened in the past. That's the big fiscal impact. And I'm going to touch on that in the slides that come. So we estimated revenues and expenditures. Revenues we estimated for local option sales tax and property tax. Let me spend some time on the local option sales tax. It amounted to about $4.8 million in fiscal 2008. I picked fiscal 2008 because that seems to be closer to the trend. 2009 was not a good year for anybody, so it's hard to use that as a starting point. 2008 makes more sense for this kind of analysis. The local option sales tax partially funds solid waste, debt service, highways, and the general fund, but it's small. It's about 6% of total revenue for primary government. But given the growth that's projected to occur in these scenarios, we're going to see an increase in local option sales tax revenue. This shows the distribution of local sales tax revenue compared to the distribution of population. Oh, you can see that now. Good. And around the county, as you can see, that 32% of the population is in the unincorporated area, but it only generates about 5% of local option sales tax revenue. So clearly, what's happening there's not much of a retail tax generating presence in the unincorporated area. And that's going to change somewhat in these scenarios. All right, so how do I estimate local option sales tax growth? We base that on the estimate of growth of retail square footage from the PB model. And we're going to assume that the municipal boundaries don't change over time. That's a pretty heroic assumption, but that's the assumption. We're going to also assume that the prices of these things that we're going to tax don't change over time. We're going to fix them in today. So what it means we're dealing in real terms, today's dollars. And we're also going to assume that we're not selling anything out there in the rural area that costs more than $1,600. Why does that matter? The single article tax, right? If you're familiar with that, the 2.7%, 2.75% local option sales tax applies only to the first $1,600 value of any article. So if you buy a 3D television out in the rural area, you're taxed on the first $1,600. But anything over that, the tax falls to zero for the local option sales tax. All right, so how do we figure out the tax revenue, take the growth, or the increase in tax revenue, take the growth in square feet, multiplied times sales per square foot, and I'll explain that in a minute, times the local option tax rate. All right, the growth in square footage that we're expected to see in the rural areas is shown here, and this is the increase from 2008, about 67,000 square feet. The increase from 2015 to 2025 is about 300,000, and then the increase from the last 10-year increment is about 655,000. As you look at how retail development is happening around town, we see a strip center develop, and what do you see move in? Chinese food, dry cleaners, hair, nails. It's kind of a replicate, it's been plopped down here and there and elsewhere. And I thought, well, maybe it's a good way to figure out what's going to happen in the rural area. So I picked as a replicate a fast food store, a convenience store, and a closeout store, a Dollar General. Figure out the square footage, multiply and plop down that replicate many times in the rural areas. I'm assuming about $180 sales per square foot. That's at the low end of the numbers that I've been able to pull off the internet for these kinds of establishments. So these should give us conservative figures. Times the tax rate at 2.75%. And this gives you the growth figures for local option sales tax in the unincorporated areas, about 300,000 in 2008, 2015. The growth increases to about $1.5 million. The next 10-year increment and increases more growth of about $3 million from the last 10 years. We'll come back to this in a second. I also estimated property tax growth, both for office, residential, office, retail, and industrial, and residential. This is done in a similar way. Look at the growth of square feet provided by PB. Figure out the price per square foot for the improvement that's going to occur, times the assessment rate, times the tax rate. Here we assume no increase in property values over time. We're keeping them constant, and no change in the tax rate over time. Now, realistically, property values will go up, and what happens to the tax rate? It's going to come down. We're fixing those over time. For residential, PB provided the growth of housing units. I used an average square footage times the price per square foot for the improvement, times the assessment rate, times the tax rate, and I did this separately for single-family and multifamily units. And the increase in the property tax revenue due to growth is shown here, about $21 million in the first 2008, 2015, and then $30 million increments in those 10 years, 2 10-year periods after that. Okay, moving to the two types of expenditures that could be sensitive to the spatial distribution of growth. One is solid waste. In the county, only Murfreesboro has municipal curbside collection. Smyrna and Laverne, if you have collection, you're paying for it. You're paying a private vendor, or use the convenience centers. One's provided in Laverne, one in Smyrna. The convenience center paid out of the budget for the county solid waste department. Part of the funding for solid waste comes from the local option sales tax. That's why it's important to estimate that. Some from the Middle Point landfill. The county gets a cut, a royalty, if you will, for every dollar disposed of, regardless of source, at Middle Point. And that has amounted to about $1 million or more that's helped fund solid waste, the convenience center and solid waste disposal from the convenience center, plus revenue from the state. Now, Middle Point is expected to reach capacity around the end of this planning period. So I've heard different estimates, 15, 20, 28 years. That would put it right at the end of the planning period. We get a huge benefit from this facility now. One, it provides revenue. Two, we don't pay fees for disposing of our waste at Middle Point. Neither the city of Murfreesboro or the county, Rutherford County, are paying any tipping fees. So revenue, lower costs, that's going to disappear at the end of the planning period if this landfill closes. So that's the 600-pound gorilla for solid waste out on the horizon, is what's going to happen with Middle Point. Recently, Middle Point lost 2 customers, Franklin County and Putnam County, due to competitors. So that cut the amount of waste going into the landfill, and that cuts the fee received by the county to help support the convenience centers and solid waste for the county. This looks at revenue, the revenue trend from Middle Point. You can see kind of peaked around 2005 and then drifted down. Now, some of this decrease in 2009, 2010 could be attributed to the business cycle. People buy less stuff, there's less to throw out, and the revenue declines at Middle Point. So you might expect the trend to go back up to about $1 million a year, assuming they keep all their contracts. So that's our assumption for solid waste revenue from this source of about $1 million a year going forward. Demand, we're assuming, is going to rise proportionally to the population growth in the county outside of Murfreesboro. Right? So demand is going to depend on how much growth is in the rural areas and in Laverne and Smyrna, since they heavily use the convenience centers in those areas. Revenue, however, is going to depend somewhat on county revenue growth, but also revenue growth of the local option sales tax in the rural area. So we have solid waste making a rough connection between increasing demand for service and increasing in revenue to the local option sales tax in the rural areas to meet that service. Now, demand exceeds, and demand is my estimate of expenditures growth. These are growth figures, roughly in balance by about 2025 and also roughly in balance by 2035. Right now, it's out of balance. Spending is greater than revenue coming in. How do they manage that? They draw down on fund balances to make up the difference. Now, again, this outlook could change a lot, will change a lot when Middle Point reaches capacity, or if Middle Point loses some more customers, cutting the amount of the fee going to fund solid waste. Now, represents a change with the past, but the scenarios are, there's not going to be much difference among the scenarios for solid waste, because we're assuming the same population growth countywide and the same distribution of population growth, urban versus rural. The second thing we looked at that is going to represent a change with the past is the demand for highway, road, and bridge services, the amount of traffic that's going to occur in the rural area. Clearly, with this kind of growth of the population, there's going to be a lot more traffic, a lot more demand for road maintenance. And here we just looked at maintenance demand. We're going to look at the capital costs of building new roads. Over the past, if you look at the past several years, the amount of spending for maintenance has been pretty strongly correlated with rural population growth. So we're taking rural growth as a proxy for the amount of traffic that's going to occur in the rural areas, assuming that maintenance demand will increase proportionally with rural population growth. What revenue sources do we use for roads, bridges, and highways? It depends on the wheel tax. And that's a countywide revenue. It's about 45% of the wheel tax. It gets a small portion of the local option sales tax and a very small portion of property tax. And state revenues are a significant source for county roads, including the state, our share of the gasoline tax. Again, I'm assuming that demand or expenditures will increase with rural traffic and rural population growth. And here are the figures for growth of revenue and maintenance that I've developed for highways. You can see the revenues not keeping up with maintenance demand over the time frame because demand rises with the rural population growth and revenue rises with the total county population growth, which is going to be slower than the rural growth. And we've assumed that per capita maintenance at its 2008 level. So this is going to be an issue, regardless of the scenario. Schools, this is where I go way out on the limb. Assuming that schools are at capacity, and the only way to accommodate growth is to build new schools, and those are two big assumptions. The kind of growth we're looking at over the next 25 years could increase the demand or cause the need to build 19 more schools, most of them elementary schools. Again, same impacts across scenarios. And I've adjusted the ADA is average daily attendance figures, adjusted that for the fact that the population is going to age and the ratio of school-age children to the total population is going to decline somewhat. As we get older, there are going to be fewer kids around, but still enough to cause a big demand for schools. How much will new elementary school cost these days? Is running around $23 million. Middle school in the mid-20s, and the figure I heard today for a new high school, anybody want to guess?
40.
50 million. So we're talking significant bucks here. My estimate is that the schools, if we build all these, would add about $23 million in debt service by 2025 and about $26 by 2035. Now, fortunately, after 2015, our debt service requirements, today's requirements, drop significantly. And that's shown in the next slide. We hover around $40 million in debt service today, 2010, through about 2015. Then it starts dropping. After 2015, drops a lot by 2025. So there's still some room out there to handle the increased debt if we can push it out beyond 2015 would be helpful. All right. The last thing I did with this fiscal analysis is looked at what if we change this assumption or test this assumption that we're keeping, the assumption is that we're holding the line on rural versus urban population growth across scenarios. What if that changes a little bit? What if, for example, the population in Smyrna, Laverne, plus the rural areas increases by 1.5% compared to Murfreesboro? That will mean that the county will need to deal with a bigger share of the K through 6 school population, and it will increase solid waste demand somewhat. What's the implication for schools? If Murfreesboro share declines and the rest of the county increases by 1.5%, then, this looks at the resulting average annual growth rates. You can see the growth rate over this entire period doesn't change much, just a tiny increase for the rest of the county, and the growth rate declines somewhat for Murfreesboro. So we're not talking about an enormous difference. What difference will it have in schools? That will increase the demand for about 4 more elementary schools in the county compared to the scenario I just discussed, and increase debt service also. Now originally, and that's all capital cost, and originally I thought, well, if there ought to be a difference in the operating cost too. Yes, operating costs will increase, but we're getting paid from the basic education formula from the state for each ADA, plus if we're taking a bigger share of K through 6 students, Murfreesboro is getting a smaller share, and they get a smaller share of the county's revenues. When you buy a soda anywhere in Rutherford County, the sales tax generated, half of that goes to schools. A portion of that goes to the Murfreesboro schools, no matter where you bought the soda. So Murfreesboro schools get about 15–16% of the half, regardless of where that sales tax is generated.
That's half of the local option.
The schools get half of local option, and Murfreesboro schools get 15% of the half. With 15% based on their share of ADA. Now, if their share declines, that means they would get a smaller share of that revenue. So the short answer here is on operating costs, it's about a wash. costs go up, but the revenues increase from the BEP, and there are fewer payments for Murfreesboro because they have a smaller share of ADA. So what we're talking about is increased capital costs, and the operating costs are just about a wash.
That sounds like you're assuming that the state funds plus the half of the local option sales tax that's earmarked for education would cover it, but we're putting property tax into the school fund now. So why would in the future we have plenty of sales tax and state dollars to cover it, but currently we don't?
I'm not sure I follow that. What I'm talking about is the amount of funds of statewide or countywide revenue that the county shares with Murfreesboro schools based on their percent of ADA.
You're suggesting that what's left over from what we'd shared with Murfreesboro would, along with the BEP dollars,
right,
fund the increased cost, the increased operating
costs. The operating costs, right.
And what I'm saying is that we now have to tap into the property tax. I don't know how much of the property tax is earmarked for education, but it's a fair chunk of it.
You take the debt service and that together is about 75%, isn't it?
That's capital improvements.
That's both capital and operational.
Two different things. He's talking about operating costs. We have to fund the property tax for building the schools.
Right.
And buying the property. Two different things. In fact,
but doesn't the operational budget require part of the property tax to fund it? The current?
Typically, no.
It does.
I think it does.
If there is a shortfall in that, it would have to come from that, but typically,
what has it been in the past?
Additional funds from the BEP, so that covers that operating cost. But the property tax comes when we have to build a $50 million school or the $20 million school. That's where that comes in.
The reason I'm asking the question is I work with those figures in my regular job. And in the past, I know there's been a portion of the property tax that's been earmarked for the operational costs of schools.
The most significant portion of the property tax for operational purposes goes to education. The next most significant would go for debt service. And then after that comes in your general fund and then roads in the hierarchy of expenditures. So there is a very significant portion of property taxes.
So I think the expectation that in the future we wouldn't need to, I guess if you're saying that as the property values grow, that will grow as well, you're not going to be funding future education solely out of state dollars plus part of the sales tax, I don't think. I think you're going to have to continue to get the growth in the property tax that you're.
And that would be what I would interpret you saying there, because
okay,
all sources right now would grow, and when you have a fall off in the city, the county picks up that excess to help offset whatever the operational increases would be, which would include the sources of revenue, property, sales tax, state BEP, whatever.
The current BEP formula is split between state and local governments, and each county has a certain percentage that varies over time depending on how they grow relative to the rest of the state. Has Rutherford's been fairly stable? Did you look at that?
I haven't looked at that. I don't know the answer.
Some areas are finding that their fiscal capacity is outgrowing their, or is growing faster than their population is, and what happens to them is the share that the state pays out of the BEP declines over time. This has been particularly true in Sevier County. When we take on a whole bunch of new retail and it raises the sales tax base per student, we typically end up having to pay more of the BEP than we did before we did that. So one of the things that we should take into consideration is that if we do successfully grow our economy, which we're all hoping to do and hoping this plan fosters that we could see a fall off in the percentage of the BEP that the state will pay.
Likely. Any other questions, comments? That concludes my comments. The bottom line is I don't expect much of a physical impact difference between the scenarios, and the big difference is going to be the scenario impacts compared to what we've seen in the past in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Penn. I think we've reviewed a lot of information tonight, and we have tried to do a couple of things. One is to just touch base on what the scenarios are, what is common to all the scenarios, and what were the assumptions that the scenarios were based upon. We've tried to identify some of the key measures of effectiveness for the scenarios, and those include the land absorption, and impacts on prime farmlands, water, sewer, schools, residential growth, and maybe one or two areas to be able to have a common point to measure one scenario against the next. And I think we've laid that out tonight as about as carefully as we can in terms of how do they stack up against each other. And then Dr. Penn has provided an overview of what all the scenarios have in common, and that is there are relatively few significant fiscal impacts. There's no discernible fiscal difference on the impacts between the scenarios that we've outlined in the three choices tonight. The biggest difference, of course, is between the base case, which is the business as usual, and then the two other scenarios. The base case scores poorly. It is the least efficient in terms of using land efficiently. It continues the low-density, infrastructure-intensive development patterns throughout the county that you've all experienced for the last couple of decades. And it scores rather poorly with respect to the economic efficiency of it relative to the value that you accrue from it, as against a couple different ways to measure it. The two scenarios that we've laid out, the suburban belt and then the urban infill, both score better in terms of how they efficiently use the land, but there are no strong discernible differences between them in terms of how they rank against the criteria. They both do better than the base case. The question there is more one of preferences and some of the choices that they provide to citizens and investors and the development community in terms of having different types of land use strategies available, different densities in different parts of the county. And that gets a little bit to your comment, Lenise, and that is, what does the market want? Well, I think you answered it perfectly. If we knew that, none of us would be in the room here tonight. We'd probably be off in Aruba someplace. Since we can't anticipate what the consumer market is going to be buying 10 or 15 years from now, what these plans do is they introduce a number of choices. And those choices can hopefully provide some flexibility in housing types and housing densities in different locations so that they can all be as responsive as possible to the market demands that we can't anticipate today. So we don't know what the market's going to be buying, but we want to put enough choices out there in the inventory that Rutherford County can remain competitive in the market for the kind of growth and development that you're seeking to do. So we've developed the alternatives, we've evaluated the alternatives, we've looked at the fiscal impact of the alternatives, and we have, I think, put together a very thorough analysis of the choices before you tonight. The alternatives don't have to be A, B, or C. There's blended models and alternatives within the alternatives in terms of a mixed model. But at this point, our planning team feels that we've done what we needed to do to lay out some choices before you, evaluate the implications of those choices, lay them out as effectively as we could in terms of their implications, and then ask this steering committee to begin the debate and discussion about which of the scenarios makes the most sense for Rutherford County and which one, in fact, is going to be the basis upon which we write the comprehensive plan. And that's the work that our team needs to do next. But we need feedback from you all and feedback from the community in terms of which of those you think best respond to the planning challenges and the desires of this community.
Well, we could go about this in a number of ways. It occurs to me that we really do have three scenarios on the table, even though we've been focusing on the two alternatives been developed. So I thought we could open this by starting to see if there's anyone on the committee that wants to make a case for a do-nothing scenario of leaving in place the structures that we have and basically accepting as our future the base case that's been laid out. All right. I think we can lay that one to the edge then. And so what that then brings us down to is what turn out to be rather finely defined differences between these suburban and the urban infill in terms of impacts on land, impacts on the fiscal part, even in the distribution of housing types. So I'd like to just throw it open at that point for observations about your perceived differences between the two plans, what you know about where this county is and where it's going, and looking for recommendations between the two and ways to merge the two.
I have a question, a comment, statement, whatever, and it might, part of it perhaps could be addressed by Mr. Waldron. The cost of the land that he has to buy to build his homes drives the market in one sense of the word. In order to get a return on his investment, he's going to have to build a certain size home in order to make a recovery on the cost of the land. But yet the market may not be able to afford that, so he gets constrained there in one instance. Keeping in mind that particular part of the puzzle, there's the other part of the ability of all the taxpayers to provide the infrastructure that may have to go along with that new demand there. So I guess maybe in the statement, perhaps musing about it in one instance there, it would seem that whatever plan you come up with, it would be one where existing infrastructure, schools, and all of that are used to their greatest efficiency, tied in with the land development. And I don't want at the same time put shackles on the developers in the process here. All of that those things are items that somehow have to be worked through, at least in my mind, and I haven't gotten there, I guess, to the answer at this stage. Just the criteria seems to me should be considered. And if Mr. Waldron has a comment on that as a builder that has to deal with those all the time, I'd certainly like to hear what he may have to say about that.
Well, over the last 20 years, the lot cost has remained pretty constant in the overall cost of the house, if that's what you're asking, as a percentage. And if you get outside those parameters, you're going to have too much in the lot. You know, if you're building a smaller house, then you can't justify building a smaller house on a certain lot. So yes, the property values do affect that. The one thing that I think Tim touched on, you know, the schools are basically at capacity anyway. So your infrastructure, regardless of where you live, and as according to the schools, would be somewhat constant. I think, you know, your cost to extend roads and water and things might be more expensive. You know, if we leave the base, you know, you're going to have to run it to the whole county. So that would run that up. I don't know if that answers what you're really asking or what, but.
In a sense it does. There's many other factors, though, that relate to those cost items, such as sheriff's patrol, city police, if it happens to be in those particular areas, EMTs, all of those cost factors, if they could be drawn down to a closer area, would seem to make more sense in any plan we come up with. But again, that tends to come back and say, well, we're going to shackle the developers into something here that may not be tenable for them. I don't know if that makes sense.
One thing on the suburban, and I don't think anyone actually covered it exactly, but it looked like to me in the suburban that the sales tax revenue, Tim, should go up because as the county would be able to keep more of it because it would not be in a potentially annexed area. Whereas now, what's in the urban growth boundaries, even though we assumed that it wasn't going to be annexed, would be annexed at some point. The more practical side is if you're looking at suburban and you've got commercial areas that are selling your sodas and your Dollar General store type items, and they're outside the city limits, then the county would keep the whole instead of getting just a part of what's in your annexed area. So your sales tax revenues could go up if you do a suburban type thing.
Yes.
I may be reading way too much into
No,
it.
it's something that our modeling did not pick up, and I talked with our people about that as well, because we were holding to certain control totals up front about how many square feet, basically, of retail, office, commercial space would be allocated between the cities and the county. Modeling does not pick up on the fact that if you did say, for example, really promote a center-based development and promoting mixed uses, when we did the allocations, there was only so many square feet of retail to toss around the county.
Right.
Right.
And that would be pretty constant to service the population that you're talking about. I understand that.
But again, the modeling does not pick up on the fact that you could increase the total square footage of commercial developed in the county altogether beyond the projections, or you could ultimately change how much goes within the cities versus the counties, depending on how attractive a market you create in some areas of the county. So, I mean, the centers can be designed to accept more retail development, basically, than the projections currently.
But even if you have one that's some distance from Smyrna or Murfreesboro, that's in a rural setting, and all of a sudden they start selling stuff that people were driving 5 miles into the city to get, Murfreesboro or Smyrna would be receiving those taxes and giving a portion of it to the county, is what I'm saying. If it remains in a rural area, the county gets to keep it all. So sales tax could go up, I think, with your suburban scenario a whole lot better than in the urban scenario.
I see. By keeping more of the property basically out of the reach of the...
Yes.
So the way the tax works, whoever collects it gets to keep half of it.
Right.
The other half is earmarked and split between the two for schools. So.
But if the county was collecting it, they would effectively get to keep it all, except
They'd
for
still
the
have to share.
15% that goes to Murfreesboro.
Right, they'd still have to share that with them.
Yes.
Yeah.
But they would be getting.
I would think that, you mentioned you were dropping the retail into the centers, the various types of centers, the rural centers and so forth. That's going to be where you would typically find that stuff with either scenario. Mm-hmm. The other scenario, there are a lot of things to recommend each of those scenarios, but I would think that the amount of sales tax that would occur outside the city limits and outside areas that it would annex would be driven more by how many and how big those rural centers are. Because they're not going to have retail in the middle of a subdivision. It's going to be in one of those little areas.
Which would be on your major corridors and thoroughfares.
Right. Where those darker dots are in the two alternatives is where that stuff will drop in. And whether it gets annexed by another city or not is going to depend on whether it can easily reach it. Because if it's very significant and it can reach it, it will get annexed.
Well, and that's where in the urban infill, that urban area roughly, in the urban infill model especially, that one is more closely aligned, I believe, with the existing urban growth boundaries, because we know the cities cannot annex outside the urban growth boundaries anyway, so that sets more of a bright line between what's potentially reachable by Murfreesboro or Smyrna, basically, as opposed to the other. There, with the suburban belt, the urban area that we modeled there was much tighter to the city limits. The urban growth boundary is a little bit beyond that. But yeah, the locations of the centers are pretty much the same.
And what I was saying is they are where the retail will land, is the centers, not in the middle of a subdivision.
Right. Yes.
I have one other question to ask Dr. Penn here, and they sound like a simple question. I think he said this a while ago. In either instance, whether it's the urban or suburban, the cost to the taxpayer for services that may be demanded because of that growth is not going to be significantly different one way or the other. Is that what I understood you to say?
The services that are provided now.
Say it again?
The services that are provided now in the budget in the county doesn't provide water or curbside garbage collection now.
Right. But providing all that stays the same, whichever one of these scenarios we might select, we're not going to see a significant fiscal impact on the taxpayer.
Now, I liked your point, though, about a higher density implies fewer trips.
That's the point I was getting to.
And we looked at that for school transportation costs, busing costs.
Right.
And you would think that with higher density, you could lower your transportation costs, picking up more kids per mile. And theoretically, that holds, except the big consideration for bus routes is socioeconomic equity. So you can have the most efficient bus route in the world, but it doesn't get you the mix of schools you want. So that's the other consideration there for buses. Now, for other services, sheriff patrols, EMTs, I would agree that if you have more trips to a focused area, that theoretically ought to lower costs.
The only thing that I was really struck by how little difference there was on most of those criteria between the two scenarios, and it seemed to me the only one that really stood out was the equating of rural with road maintenance, that to the extent that people are spread out further, there's that higher expectation as you get more people on the roads that those roads are going to be improved and better maintained. But looking at the 2-mile radius around schools, the land consumption rate, several other factors, there's not anything that just slaps you in the face about the difference between the two scenarios. And so it almost gets down to, even though that's not our charge, kind of looking at palatability and likelihood of success of the plan that we come up with.
In a sense, it almost seems as though, I know that the lines don't fall out exactly like this, but the urban infill versus the suburban scenario is almost like you've taken the urban infill, the urban fringe area, from there and split it in two pieces to create the suburban one, where maybe it'd be slightly denser in the closest to the city limits part of that, and a little less dense. One of the things I like about the suburban ring is that we don't create an expectation that there's going to be a sudden, there's a cliff.
There's no bright line
between the urban development, and then all of a sudden beyond that you've got rural. And as a practical matter, we don't see that typically now. It kind of just incrementally grows out. There's spots where somebody has a farm they're ready to sell, and it's close enough to existing infrastructure to make it practical. It can get water and somehow handle the wastewater. And so it develops in a little spot out there, not quite adjacent to other stuff, but really, if you look at the pattern overall, you don't have big cliffs where it goes from, where there's a huge transition in the type of land development that you see. So it seems like this one with suburban ring is a little bit more reflective of what we typically see and could expect.
And I think that's what we were thinking when we first tried to lay out that scenario, and then as we refined it a little bit during the modeling, is that yes, with the urban infill, in theory, that's where the planning process wants to go, with having those pre-designated hard areas of intense development versus rural development. But as you pointed out, it's hard to find any place where that bright line is so evident, and on this side this happens, and on that side that happens. That's probably unpalatable, as you put it, and it is not realistic. The suburban belt, and the good thing about these plans is, again, they are general guides. Yes, we've run them through models and we've come up with specific numbers, but they're guides. It is your regulations ultimately. It's your zoning that will ultimately bring any plan to life. The suburban belt has the advantage of it does provide somewhat of a transition, and the lines may be blurred somewhat between where suburban area picks up and rural area, or suburban lets off and rural picks up. It can be somewhat flexible. You could tie what you would like to see the edge of the suburban belt to some distance from the urban fringe, And where the city limits eventually grow, where the urban growth boundaries of the city grow. As time goes on and densities change and the cities grow and change, your suburban boundary may need to expand a little bit. It truly is a buffer between those areas along the edges of the county that either have topographical and soil challenges or just those areas where you do have remaining pockets of farmland that you want to try to preserve. And that the suburban belt serves as sort of a buffer that could grow and expand a little over time, better than that urban infill that does try to set a hard edge between dense, non-dense, urban, rural. And the suburban gives you that, there's your flexibility in setting densities in the future.
So what you're saying, it's not to say that your urban fringe wouldn't grow over time and could even exceed, continue to spread out, as would the suburban character, the next one, as such.
Right. The point of the plan being that you state that you want to have these areas of different density and different types, and that you want them in some way, just because I think it makes sense the way the county's laid out, that you tie them to the intensity of development around Murfreesboro, Laverne, and Smyrna, just because they have such a dominant pattern in the middle of your county. And that somewhat makes it easier because you know your growth is going to be concentrated really in those areas. And that the urban areas or the suburban areas, depending on what you want to put in place, yes, can grow, because they could change over time depending on the conditions, and your zoning would be designed to reflect that at any given point in time.
Tim, on the suburban, the way the map shows, though the suburban would support your centers because it's getting population near your centers, and it'd be more likely that those centers would develop if you had population around them. And I remember when we did the breakout 2 meetings ago, it was pretty constant, at least in our group, that the people wanted, that the people on the board here wanted to maintain the identities or try and establish those. They want Christiana to be Christiana. They don't want it to be Murfreesboro in particular. They want, Rockvale to still be Rockvale. And if you have the suburban scenario, I think it supports those centers better than if you have the urban where everybody's in Murfreesboro. Well, nobody's going to drive out to Rockvale to shop if they're all right around Murfreesboro, or they're not going to. So I could see the centers and those historic communities that are in Rutherford County developing as a center better as a suburban scenario than if we were to go the urban scenario.
Well, the urban scenario, if I remember correctly, sort of grew out of the table that dealt with more conservation maps. And what if we looked at a model that had areas, that had large areas set aside for preservation or very, very low density development? And then we saw, though, through the modeling, the end result on land consumption and some of this, it didn't. It's
pretty much incidental.
Because part of this, because we've all been talking about new development.
Right.
But the really big elephant in the room is the existing development, what's already out there, and the land pattern that's really already set. And I think we're seeing both in these numbers and then what Dr. Penn has put forward. You're going to be servicing that existing population and that existing development pattern from now on as well. Where the homes and developments already are is where they are. You're going to run school buses down those roads. You're going to have to maintain those roads. That land is already consumed. So there's a certain momentum that's already in place that you can't back up. You can't pull those developments out of the ground and put them back in centers. You've already got a pretty scattered pattern as it is. So that's why I think we're seeing among those two scenarios, the two alternatives, not a whole lot of difference in some of these key numbers, because we're recognizing the fact that your existing pattern is pretty dominant. But that's why I think the suburban belt goes a little further toward addressing that, the idea of trying to create centers out there for the future development, but recognizing we have a pretty predominant suburban pattern in a large swath around this county, and there's really no backing it up.
I believe the suburban belt plan will make much more sense. I would agree with David. We develop commercial retail, and there has to be enough population to support that, or it will not survive. And I don't know that the urban infill, that the centers out in the rural areas would ever make it, or that they would be enticing to the people that live out there. I think if these retail centers are located on the concentric exterior of that suburban development, that people will tend to move outward to go do those things instead of back into the city to where we're congesting the existing roads that are at somewhat of a capacity now. So I agree that this makes more sense. I think it certainly has more flexibility. And back to what Lenise said, is no one knows what people want today, and it will certainly be different 10 years from now. And I think this offers a lot of opportunities for whatever type of development that might come. I think it's very nice.
I think I had the opposite thought about the suburban versus I'm getting the names confused. The suburban belt and the urban infill as far as the centers go. Because with the concept of, well, one of our goals was provide neighborhoods that create a sense of community and connectedness. And that's where the idea of the village centers and the rural centers came from. And what would attract people to want to live in those communities and make the historic communities continue on. And with the urban infill, if it was not as attractive to just build anywhere, they would gravitate toward those centers, which in turn, my way of thinking, which in turn would make it more attractive for retail establishments to locate there because they knew that's where a center of population would be.
Yes, and that is when we set up the urban infill and we're trying to decide where to set that outer boundary. That was one of the things that we discussed internally as well. Then what does that do to the attractiveness of those centers and the likelihood that they would develop? If we make the urban boundary too big, there is no incentive to really see the centers develop. So we tried to find a balance in there how big this urban footprint would be as opposed to the rural footprint with the pockets of development in the centers. But yes, that was something that we had discussed
and
internally.
That develops that sense of community, and that sense of community very often gets people supporting their local retail.
Yes.
Because it's special, like, the Miller's Grocery in Christiana.
Well, go ahead.
Well, that's an interesting one that you pulled out. I was just sitting here thinking there's kind of two examples I can give. One would be the Eagleville example. It was interesting on the tax, Dr. Penn's taxes, that they were population and sales tax were very close to exactly the same in Eagleville. I think it's rural enough that it collects rural people from a large area that come to Eagleville as their community. Christiana is really in a quasi-suburban setting anymore. And yet it's still a center for both for people that live out there and for people that go out there for the small community experience. Mm-hmm. So I think these centers have a lot of flexibility. They can be viable in a number of different settings.
Well, in Eagleville, just by virtue of its location, we didn't pick this up in any way through our modeling, draws from outside the county, obviously, whereas the others are more dependent on internal, yes, so.
Tim, I think these centers can be very successful in cutting down on traffic trips. You can help me here. Between Nashville and Clarksville, there's a good example, I think, of a center on Highway 41A. You know what I'm talking about?
At Pleasant View?
Pleasant View.
Yes.
Very attractive center, very attractive. Mixed use. There's a lot of office space, commercial, residential. And, you know, I think the way that it's structured now, we could see something like this, not in all of our areas. They're not all situated for that, but certainly in some of them. And I think, you know, I don't know if anybody else has seen Pleasant View, but it's very attractive development there. And I would be very proud if areas of Rutherford County developed like that.
That area, I mean, and it was, of course, it was planned out in advance with that core area to it, a real downtown, if you will, that has that commercial core plus a little civic space, a little open space, and all, and then the starts with multifamily development around it and the upper level developments, and then goes on out into single family and move further out. Just even within the last couple of years, even with the economic downturn, my understanding is still doing very well market-wise. It maybe is a little slow up front as people sort of got used to this different concept of it. But that is an example of creating a community where one did not exist. That was just an area off the interstate.
Yeah, well, I remember back in the early 70s, before I-24 went through there, I lived in Clarksville, and going through Pleasant View, there was a couple of stores, but not much. But really? There was, yes, there were a couple of stores there. But that was a community, Pleasant View. I mean, it's always been a community there. And I don't know anybody that lives there, but I feel certain they're proud of it.
Yeah, it's a community a lot like when you look at it, when you were driving back and forth, it's a community a lot like some of our communities are today. And its proximity to I-24 made it possible for it to develop that way, because I'll bet you the people who live there, by and large, work in Nashville. Some of them may be in Ashland City, but I bet you a whole lot of them work in Nashville. So to the extent that some of our potential nodes are located near 840 or I-24, I think there's great possibility for focusing on those areas for that kind of development. As a practical matter, it is typically going to be people who commute to other areas for work. And Cheatham County, which is where Pleasant View is, has the highest commuting outside the county rate of any county in the state. Something like 75% of the people who live there and work someplace else, not in Cheatham County. That creates some challenges for you tax base wise, because you lose if you can attract the jobs to the same place, and they do have some there because they have some in the village that serve them. If you can attract the jobs to the same place that the people live, then you really get the benefit of that population growth in terms of being able to fund the services that the local governments, whether it's the city or the county, need to provide. Cheatham is going to have some challenges there in the long run.
In Pleasant View?
Cheatham County in general.
Oh, in general, okay.
Yeah. In order to fund their school systems, for instance, they don't have anything like the retail that we have, that Dr. Penn talked about, helping to fund our schools as its population grows in the future. Cheatham County doesn't have anything like that, and they're so close to Nashville, and they have so many good routes to get into Nashville. They're much more of a bedroom.
Well, and a lot of their land's not even available for development. I mean, it's held by the public, so they really have to be careful with what developable land they have left. At least here you are. You're blessed with the fact that most of the land it's in private hands. At least you at least have some choice in it. It's not you're held by the state.
At least you don't have to provide services to the state's land.
That's true.
No school children live there.
Let's move this along a little. It sounds like Susan, at least, is a proponent of the urban infill scenario. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I lean that way because I felt that would develop the centers more, but after this discussion, I'm not sure that it makes that much difference. But I was also wondering about with the urban infill, because we have such an exodus of people working in Davidson County, the access to the transportation routes and, but people will live where they want to live and drive the distance they want to drive.
You know, speaking as a person who moved here, and who lives in Rutherford County and works in Nashville, I didn't get the job in Nashville and then pick Rutherford County. I picked Rutherford County, and I wanted a job in Rutherford County. And I could not find the kind of job that I wanted in Rutherford County, and that's the only reason I drive to Nashville. It is not my preference. I don't want to live in Nashville. I don't want to live in Davidson County, grew up there. I want to live here in Rutherford County, but I sure would like a job here. And I think there are a lot of people who commute like I do who would love to have a job in Rutherford County so they didn't have to spend 2 hours a day driving back and forth. I was disappointed that we didn't have any effective difference in the number of jobs we were going to have compared to the number of households and the number of people, no matter what we do. And I know there's only so much you can do with the kind of plan that we're developing here, and it's things outside of it that are going to determine what the ratio is of jobs to the population that we have. But I hope somewhere in the broader process we work. And we've had some improvements in that respect over the last 10 years, but I hope we can move further in that direction. I calculated the ratio of jobs to population and the ratio of jobs to households in these various scenarios, and over this period of time, we're not really seeing improvements.
One thing that we have not really included in this plan process, but will take place over time too, is the push this region has for more mass transit options and for more alternatives.
And that just makes it easier to work someplace else.
But either one of
jobs to locate someplace else.
Well, but either one of these scenarios at least can support additional development along the core area that were probably served by transit. And transit can be used as well for internal county travel, even though right now all you have is the Rover system in Murfreesboro. You know, I've talked with Dana Richardson as well, and, you know, Rover will go where there's a population base to serve it. And they would be interested in looking at areas that potentially set up outside of Murfreesboro just simply for local travel and for expanding their service out to include some of the centers or the pockets that make it feasible for them. So either one of the alternatives help in some respect to get that job housing connection a little better, then you'd have a better opportunity to influence those numbers. And because again, we stuck with some of the initial projections on these distributions. That doesn't mean that's what has to happen, of course.
Is there anyone who hasn't spoken yet that would like to?
I have a question, Tim. I'm pretty much a pilgrim at all this, but did either of the scenarios encourage or discourage commercial, retail, industrial, or discourage residential? A few meetings ago, you presented in Robertson County where obviously residential does not pay its way. Is that something this group is that a path we're going to be leading the Planning Commission down to say we need to be encouraging commercial, retail, industrial for better tax base and discouraging not only for that, but, you know, for water reasons? I mean, obviously, I would think residential, everything costs more for residential, whether it's your resources, police protection, fire protection, everything is more costly for residential. Do we need to be looking down the road and, for lack of a better term, discouraging residential growth?
Well, I think part of the influence that say in Robertson County and in those studies that the American Farmland Trust looked at were residential uses are generally tied to lower densities and larger lots. So you're talking about per acre served. Yes, you sort of run at a net loss. Through either of the scenarios you're looking at here, you're not so much trying to discourage residential development itself as you're trying to encourage greater densities in certain areas, less acreage involved per household, and trying to contain the costs that way. By encouraging the promotion of these employment centers that we've set up along 24 and then outside of Smyrna, you're certainly encouraging more employment opportunities, more non-residential, higher assessed uses, both from property tax standpoint and from potential produced revenue. So yes, either one of these scenarios encourages Because, again, we're dealing with certain projections that have been made a few years ago, the plan, stated policy of the plan is to encourage a better balance of residential and non-residential, despite maybe because of what the projections show. So either one of these scenarios, through the use of centers of different types, not just these rural centers, but again, the employment centers and the activity center that's proposed on the north part of the county, seeks to increase that non-residential development, but also to put the residential development in a different pattern that will have a better impact on the future costs.
Another thing that I'd like to, I think I'm headed the right direction. On the Suburban, in several of our discussions, it was anticipated that we don't affect the property values of the existing property owners. And I would anticipate the Suburban would probably maintain those property values in the areas that, I don't know, it just seems like it would be, lend itself more potentially to maintaining whatever property values are there than if you had it so impacted around Murfreesboro and Smyrna.
Well, I mean, of course, potential property values are influenced in a number of ways, and part of the ultimate result there may come down more into how you actually implement this plan, the sort of regulatory tools and opportunities you offer people, say with residential development, with subdivision development, where we're trying to look at both preserving sensitive areas, preserving farmland, but still allowing development, things like conservation subdivision design that increases density on parts of property but leaves the rest of it in open space. There's at least anecdotal evidence to show that those lots sell and have a higher value per acre than traditional subdivisions in some situations. So I mean, there's ways that you can implement this that you at least set up to try to have a positive impact on property values. What ultimately happens is more market-based, but there are specific tools that other communities have used and that we'll look at proposing here for putting these policies in place that, I mean, nobody wants to reduce property values. Certainly want to keep them stable, if not increase.
The Suburban map has all of the same centers on it as the Infill map, with the exception of one, I think. If we could load that one over and maybe somehow emphasize a little more that there would be residential development of maybe a suburban kind of nature around some of those centers that we're calling rural centers. You're going to have people on how many acres, what's the ratio between homes and acres in the suburban band? Do you remember?
In the suburban, was it 4?
4
to 1. 4, I think it was 4 units per acre.
4 units per acre. Yeah. If you had that, you'd probably have to have something like that density around those centers in order for them to generate enough roofs for retail to come in.
Yes, and actually, I think the village centers, we were looking at a potential of 10 units per acre for village centers, and so I think it was either 4 or 6.
Closer on some of those, we would see that blob then differentiates into different colors, and there'd be more.
Yes, and
so
I mean, we looked at a rough buffer just to apply to all of them. I think rural centers was either a quarter or a half acre buffer from the actual center. Exactly how big that is could vary depending on which one, on how much land you basically want to include in that higher density. They don't have to be fixed.
So are the rural centers and the village centers and so forth, neighborhood centers in the suburban map, are they the same in character, size, and complement as the ones on the urban infill?
Well, they were for the modeling. Now, how we ultimately put this in place, that's where you get to make choices.
So to some extent, what Susan was looking for and liking in the urban one is also showing up in the suburban one.
Yes, I think so, because I didn't want to go too far when we ran these models to just say, okay, we're going to have to really differentiate here. Let's take out half these centers on this one. I didn't want to do that just arbitrarily. Although we talked a little bit, I think, in our work session, that's where we decided to drop a couple of the centers. Where they were especially in the urban area. But again, now that we've seen, at least through running these numbers, that there's roughly some similar things happening here. this is where you could get into kind of blending if you wanted to, that you like, say, the idea of a suburban belt. You like having that transition area between rural and urban, but maybe you want to vary the number of centers from what we're showing. Either decrease some in the suburban area and add more to the rural, or the other way around. I mean, whatever variation you want to do is how we'd ultimately write up the plan. I mean, we're not going to be running new numbers because they really don't. They're a guidepost. We'll write the thing up with whatever variations or limited options you want to see.
Was there an estimate of units per acre for the village, for the rural centers?
Yes.
It's really funny, I think about units per acre, and I live on almost an acre and a half. And I cannot imagine putting 10 houses on half of that.
Well, not necessarily 10 houses. We're talking twin dwelling units. That could be, could be, a quadplex. Could be, could be a series of townhouses.
Yeah.
Somebody hold that. Okay, rural centers, for example. Single-family residential, we ran a density of actually 6 units per acre. Just to see what the numbers would do. I think the modeler actually ran it first at 4 and just wasn't showing any difference, so he ran it at 6. So it basically says obviously the more units you allow per acre in the centers, the fewer units there will be to scatter out elsewhere, but 6.
So the suburban belt would have 4 units per acre.
The suburban belt, now again, the suburban belt deals with that sort of character area outside of the centers.
Yes.
And the suburban character area itself, 4 single-family units per acre within the center, within any rural centers that are sitting in there, 6. So
that might encourage the village and the rural centers, as far as the developer is concerned, they can get more bang for the buck per acre.
Yes, and maybe to make it even more enticing, that when you ultimately set some, do an overlay or whatever you're going to do to designate a center, that you even go higher than that or allow higher than that. And as we get into options such as, looking at development rights and that sort of thing, to make it even more enticing within those centers, if they could accept development rights from those areas outside the centers. But certainly, just obviously, the more intensive you make it within the centers, if it's attractive enough and draws that development in, that's fewer households to go out in the character area anyway.
Now, is there any difference in the scenarios? I'm looking at our list of goals: conserve and enhance significant natural landscapes and historic cultural resources. Is there any difference in the scenarios for that goal?
I don't believe so. Depending on how, not that we modeled anyway, and certainly either one that we wrote up, we proposed that either of the scenarios recognize those features, identify them on the ground, and set a buffer around them anyway.
Now, is that all going to be done in the zoning?
Well, certainly. Yes, there,
process.
But even before that. Within the policies that tell how to make this plan come to life, we'll put that in there. And then you'll decide when you get to the zoning phase how, and I don't want to get too far ahead, but you'll decide then how the timing of these things, how quickly you want to see some things develop and how quickly you want to put some different things on the ground.
One more question about units per acre. What is it for the rural area?
The rural character area, 1. It was modeled at 1 unit per acre.
Okay. What else?
Is everyone to the point that they are ready to make a choice between the 2 scenarios you've been presenting?
I'm sorry?
Is everyone to the point that you're able to select one of the 2 as your preferred option? All right.
Oh, dear.
Susan, I think, is badly conflicted. I'm going to throw out one more comment before we do it, which is that if, and it's back to what I said earlier, when you look at the urban fringe, it's what would be allowed in the area. And it does not demand that people that develop in that area have to develop to that density. And I think that if we went for exclusively an urban design, then transitioning immediately to rural, that if in a practical way what we would end up with is a lot of suburban development inside the urban designated areas because there's going to be a demand for it. So that's just my parting shot on it. Well, let's do a simple show of hands, I think, to get this started. How many at the table, realizing that we may make adjustments on the details later, in general, prefer the suburban fringe model? Okay. And the urban infill model?
And it's just because I want to preserve the rural areas. But I see that, both scenarios are so close. But it's just my heart speaking.
All right. Well, I think we have a pretty strong carry on this. We want to talk a little bit about where we would go from this in terms of fine-tuning.
Yes. You guys are a bunch of hard workers. I really admire that. You guys have done a good job to listen through hours and hours of data tonight and try to sort it all out and understand what it means and then make informed decisions about that. That's not easy, and you've done a good job with that, so thanks for hanging in there. Where we go from here, I think that we have got direction from the steering committee, and it's pretty broad-based, and we're going to draft the comprehensive plan right now. I think we've got all the pieces that we need to get us to the point that we now have a detailed outline of what the plan should look like. We have the vision. We know what the existing conditions analysis said. We've done a very careful job of looking at the scenarios. You've selected a preferred scenario. We'll develop that in more detail and prepare that into an overall draft comprehensive plan that we're working on now. And we will then start right at the same time to start working on the zoning ordinance, because they should not start, one should not start when the other ends, but we have enough direction on the guidance of the plan now that we can start to take apart your existing ordinance and see what works well and what doesn't, and start to that process as well. So we're going to start to write the plan, and we will do that as expeditiously as we can. We'll bring it back to you in draft form as soon as we can, but we want to make sure it's sufficiently done that it represents the work that you've done and that we're ready to kind of get it out there in the community. How we do that exactly and when we do that, we'll coordinate with staff on, but that's our next steps. And I think you've given us the direction tonight that we needed to be able to move forward. And again, we're still on base to have the project done next spring. We'll get the plan in production. We'll start to look at the zoning and subdivision regulations, which are the implementation tools, and we'll start to work on that, both of those right away. So you've done what the community has asked you to do in terms of give us some direction. The ball's in our court now. We'll follow through on that, and then we'll be back with you and we have a draft plan for your review. Doug? Elizabeth? Tim, great job presenting the information tonight. With that, Mayo, we'll turn it back to you.
All right. No further ado, if you will adjourn.
Can we get a copy of Dr. Penn's